Welcome to Living Proof, Experience as Evidence in Pain Research.
Where people who live with pain get to ask the questions and guide the conversation instead of just answering the surveys. This podcast is brought to you by PEPR, the Partnership for the Engagement of People in Pain Research.
Funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Williams. I'm one of the co-directors of the PEPR Partnership. I sit on Pain Canada's National Advisory Committee, and I'm lucky to be on the steering committee of the Putting the Pieces Together conference for people with pain, by people with pain. I live with pain, I help people manage pain, and I'm proud to share my voice advocating for people that live with pain across Canada. And I'm joined by Emerald Asuncion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emerald, and I am excited to step into my new role as PEPR's Community Consultations Research Assistant. I am a community health professional, a human ecologist, and a Filipino artist living with chronic pain. I love to co-create spaces of embodied connection among Filipinos and our intersecting community. Welcome, everybody.
We are Living Proof, Experience as Evidence.
Today, we are joined by the directors of PEPR to gain a deeper understanding of this important work.
PEPR is an interdisciplinary national project that aims to determine what meaningful engagement can look like based on the knowledges and experiences of people living with chronic pain and marginalization, with a greater focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization in this area.
Fiona Webster is a critical sociologist and lead director of the PEPR project. She is associate professor in the Labatt Family School of Nursing at Western University and holds a cross appointment with the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, where she is also an academic fellow with the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research.
Kathleen Rice is assistant professor and research director in the Department of Family Medicine at McGill University, where she holds the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in the Medical Anthropology of Primary Care. She has recently been appointed as the co-director of the PEPR Partnership and is widely published in biomedical, anthropological, and Africanist journals.
Dr. Laura Connoy is a critical sociologist whose research interests center on chronic pain, trauma, and social injustice. She is the research manager for the PEPR Partnership and postdoctoral associate. In this latter role, she is involved in various research projects that focus on patient engagement in chronic pain research among systemically and structurally marginalized populations.
Welcome, everybody, and welcome to my co-host, Emerald. It really is such a pleasure to start off this podcast with you three. You are all people who I've learned so much from over the last couple of years being a part of this, and so I'm really looking forward to dig into this conversation. So to start, I want to ask a question for all of you, but first we'll hear from Fiona and then I'll work around the room. Fiona, I'm curious, what is it that called you to do this type of work in chronic pain and working with marginalized people specifically?
It's a great question, Desmond. The PEPR project really grew out of a long-standing interest I have in looking at the intersection between health and culture and its impact on health equity and the social and structural determinants of health. There's lots of reasons why I would take up this kind of work. Some of it personal biography, some of it sort of interest as my interests evolved at university, and some of it is just chance. The first sociology course I ever took was in sociology of health and equity. Actually, they called it health inequality. And I also grew up sort of on feminist theory, which is, of course, a critical perspective looking at gender inequity. So I think that naturally led me to learning about being interested in and wanting to do advocacy around other intersecting forms of oppression and inequity. So that sort of the piece around social justice has just always been a part of what I'm doing.
Thanks, Fiona. And Kate, I'm curious, Fiona mentioned something about culture as well. If there's certain components of your background that led you to working specifically with pain and marginalization.
All of my research, both in the chronic pain domain and in the other areas that I work, focuses on inequity in some way. So as soon as you focus on inequity and health, all these issues of EDI come to the fore. My personal background is as an anthropologist, and you mentioned that culture piece. Culture is kind of the central problem of anthropology as a discipline that we approach in modern times, in contemporary times, in a critically minded way. The PEPR project fits very centrally with the way that I have always worked as a researcher, and that I've been trained to think since the very beginning of my journey as a person who's always learning and as a person who's a researcher by profession.
Awesome. Thanks. And it really is interesting how all of these things can inform just how we look at pain in general, because pain doesn't have any particular designation in diseases or anything. It belongs to everyone. And with that, being able to inject some cultural understanding helps how we actually talk about pain with different groups of people and learning how they understand about pain as well. And Laura, I would like to shift to you as well and just ask you that same question. How is it that you got to this place of working with pain and marginalization and social injustice?
I guess I'm similar to Fiona and Kate in the sense that I have training in critical theory and methodology, largely stemming back to grad school, like my master's and then gradually my PhD. And, the way that I was trained largely as a critical qualitative sociologist. And so originally, what I was doing for my PhD, I was very interested in experiences among refugee claimants and seeking out access to primary care services during a time when health insurance coverage for this specific population of people was under attack. And a lot of the access to care coverage that was provided was stripped away under very unfortunate and very unjust rationalities, largely based on issues of citizenship and the idea of bogusness. And so I've been kind of raised in this space where emphasis as a critical researcher, especially, right, we're trained to call out injustice and inequity. And so when my PhD was coming to an end, when I had finished, I had come across a position working with Fiona under her PIHR funded COPE2 study, standing for chronic pain ethnography. And the focus of that particular project was on chronic pain experiences among marginalized populations. And so I was very interested in this kind of intersection of marginalization and health, and having found this opportunity, I wanted to pursue it. And then from there, transitioning gradually into PEPR. That's essentially how I've come to be in this space, just through this general interest in health and healthcare experiences among marginalized groups.
Thanks, Laura. And I think it's interesting with all three of you that, a lot of this interest, it comes from the more you learn, the more you know about all of the different components of our identities and how we live in this world are what brings that passion into this project as well, because once you know this stuff, you can't unlearn it. And one of the foundational ideas that has been introduced through this is shifting the perspective from people with pain being just patients to engaging with people as patients, but also as participants in the research. And so when we talk about engaging with people, instead of just referring to it as patient engagement, we are looking to shift into participant engagement. How is it that we are going to take this from theory into actual working accessibility for people? So Fiona, I'm curious if you could start with sharing a little bit of how you see what participant engagement is and how it works.
Yeah. So, you've raised a very important point, Desmond, that language doesn't just describe, it creates our understanding of things. So, yes, when we refer to people as patients, that word presupposes a relationship, first of all, an inequitable relationship between a patient and provider. It also erases any other aspect of somebody's identity. So, by talking about participant engagement, we're trying to bring the fullness of who people are back into the conversation. Changing the language is one of the ways we can begin to change some of the structures and systems and ways of understanding things around us. However, when you have a term like patient engagement that's really entrenched in people's imagination and in people's vocabulary, just changing that one word might not be sufficient or even possible. So, there's all these other ways that we're looking to bring sort of the fullness of people's beings and social contexts into the conversations about health and health research. So it's not just as simple, unfortunately, it's just changing one word, but we try to stay conscious of the language that we're using.
Okay.
Desmond, you very astutely asked, how are we going to actually do this move from this idea to its actualization? And I think to me, that is one of the primary purposes and goals of PEPR is to figure that out. We know that something isn't right, for instance, in referring to people as patients in the kinds of situations that we're trying to address here. But knowing that something is not right doesn't necessarily mean quite yet what the best alternative is. So I think one of the things that we're really trying to do with PEPR is, in a very collaborative way that is led by people with that knowledge, figure out how are we going to do it.
Thanks, Kate. And, I think when it comes to this idea of engagement with patients, participants, when we're doing research, this is a concept that relates to every aspect of research, not just chronic pain and marginalization. But I'm curious, what is it that guided the early writing for this particular project to be focused on chronic pain and marginalization specifically?
That's a good question, Desmond. So that came out of early conversations I was having based on the COPE work I was doing, actually with Maria Hudspeth of Pain BC. And we'd already, working with Kate and then later with Laura through COPE and looking at these issues related to chronic pain and marginalization. I think Maria and her work in Pain BC and Pain Canada has long had a strong focus on issues of equity and social justice as well. So that's sort of, if you're asking, like the very early ideas for this came from that. And I think patient engagement is sort of the thing we're looking at, but behind that, and in addition to that, what we're looking at is not just who are we engaging in research and how are we engaging them, but how can we bring the priorities of marginalized groups to the research table. So that's part of what we're trying to do here as well. So there's an advocacy piece that's built into it. And as Kate said, this movement toward change, trying to sort of turn this ship around is going to take a huge collective effort and a lot of time. So we're building on the work of others doing amazing work in this space as well. We're working with all our patient collaborators and other researchers to try and make this movement toward change, not just for chronic pain, but I think for healthcare in general. I hope that answered your question.
Yes. And to me, it really speaks to the hope that is behind this project as well, because there are a lot of things that seem to be glaring that could be changed in the way that we engage with people just in general and trying to help. And this seems to be a project that is trying to envision some of those ways that we can change and make things better for the people who are actually informing the research. So thanks, Fiona. And when it comes to the type of participant engagement that we are looking to do, I'm curious if any of you had any thoughts on what it is that we would consider meaningful engagement with either communities or marginalized groups that we are hoping to work with in these projects.
So Laura, you go ahead.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about what we mean by meaningful, just kind of building on what Fiona and Kate have mentioned, this is something that I think we're going to learn in our conversations and consultations with communities. And I think ultimately it's fair to say that at least beginning with knowing what some of the existing issues are with patient engagement and knowing what hasn't worked and what hasn't been meaningful so far in the lives of people living with chronic pain and as well as marginalization. And so recognizing that there are pre-existing unequal power relations between people who are involved in research studies and researchers, the lack of diversity among people living with chronic pain on research projects, and just kind of general underlying mechanisms of exclusion that tend to define patient engagement as is currently practiced. So that can include, for example, the fact that some of these research projects are occurring within university settings that are often historically connected to oppression and domination and can actually be unsafe spaces for certain people living within the community, and also privileging, certain forms of communication or knowledge. And this is often those that are deeply embedded within Western scientific and medical knowledge. And also knowing that we're aware of the fact too that people living with chronic pain who are invited onto research projects as a form of engagement, often when they come onto projects, they're trained in ways that align with overarching research designs that in themselves are problematic and doesn't necessarily recognize othered knowledges and experiences. So, I think beginning from this spot, knowing what the issues are, while also learning what is meaningful and needed and wanted by and among communities living with chronic pain and marginalization. I think this is how eventually we'll come to get a better understanding of what meaningful engagement means.
Yes. And I really appreciate how that it truly does highlight that we are working with so much theory and so many ideas, but when it comes down to what is meaningful, that answer is going to come from who we are actually engaging with, not from what we think is going to be important. And so, in that same vein, I'd like to check in with my co host, Emerald, and who is somebody who is fairly new on the PEPR project, but has had a chance to be engaged in a number of the things that we have going on. And I'm curious if you have noticed any differences in how PEPR is doing certain things as far as incorporating your thoughts and ideas as a person with lived experience, as opposed to maybe some other advocacy projects that you're working on.
Desmond, I've had a lot of thoughts spinning, especially with this conversation, and how excited I am to contribute to this portion of the project in regards to community consultation. I think a lot about the importance of relations building and the reality of the speed that you're moving in is at the speed of the trust that you can build with people. And it's speaking to everything that we've spoken about so far, from patient engagement to culture and acknowledging the experience of each person's culture and find the commonalities so that we can find universal ways of relating to each other, because there actually is so much that we have in common that we can move forward with that people refuse to or just are not available to witness in the day to day. And I think even go from patient to participant, how easy is that? Like those little shifts though, they do really make a difference. And they are possible. I don't think it's a huge stretch to shift a mindset change on something like that. And it's going to get complicated with a lot of our other goals, but I'm here for all of that. In terms of other projects though, like I'm just thinking about my experiences in patient advocacy and how I personally could have been the person that now in this role of community consultations, I had the relationships with the patients and researchers were reaching out to me to engage with the patients. And the feedback I was getting was feeling a little bit like tokenized or undervalued. They're unable to really dive in and offer as much as they can. And when we can build that trust, there's more reciprocity in that energy exchange and that ability to cultivate more richness in our responses and our research results. So,
Thanks, Emerald. And I think based off of what both you and Laura had said there speaks to the fact that we have a few years on this project. And the reason that we have more than a few years on this project is because this is really hard work and it's so worth it to be doing this. But we're going to have to take our time and be thoughtful and careful as we move forward. And a big part of that is, like you say, Emerald, building those relations so that we can figure out what the meaningful engagement is, but also finding ways on how we're going to be able to communicate with each other in translating some of this theory that we're working with into actual working process and meaningful engagement with people. And so the next thing I'd like to move on to is working through translating some of the language that we use as a foundation for the PEPR project. And so the idea of institutional ethnography. And when this concept was first brought up to me, I remember hearing that some people take years to truly grasp the concepts of what it really is and how it can be useful. But just to set some foundation for some of our viewers, if maybe we could start with Laura, if you could share a little bit about your thoughts on institutional ethnography.
Well, if it's okay, I'm
Yeah.
going to actually open the floor to Fiona, largely because of her extensive training with institutional ethnography and being trained by Dorothy Smith, who's essentially the founder of institutional ethnography. I feel I'm not sure I wouldn't do as much justice to IE as Fiona would.
I'm sure you could, Laura, but I'm happy to answer the question. So IE, for short, is an approach to sociology developed by a feminist sociologist, as Laura mentioned, Dorothy Smith. And it's a really unique approach within sociology that allows us to locate the structure, the institution within people's everyday experiences. So we're not thinking about people so much as individuals as we're thinking about their standpoint within larger systems and institutions. So it's a way of finding the macro in that everyday lived experience. So I think it's very powerful for that. So to give you a quick example, you'll hear people say, oh, the health system's broken, but you can't fix something that's that abstract. So IE allows us to find that health system within people's everyday experiences and then shows us where to look for how to change it. So the idea of social change is really embedded in the approach.
Thanks, Fiona.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you have anything that you can recall of research that has been done with an IE perspective in relation to pain.
So we've done work using IE in relation to pain. Yes. So Kate, why don't I let you jump in and talk about that work?
Sure. PEPR developed out of almost a decade of IE research looking at chronic pain. Specifically, we didn't start where this podcast started. We didn't even start with the marginalization piece. We were really interested in understanding the social organization of chronic pain care, initially in the province of Ontario specifically. And through doing institutional ethnographic research on that topic, it became increasingly clear that there was this category of, at the time, framed as patients who were much more complex and particularly poorly served by the way that chronic pain care was organized. So everything that led to PEPR was the result of turning that institutional ethnographic lens increasingly on these people who have both chronic pain and marginalization of various kinds, very diverse identities that don't fit within that kind of stereotypical patient who is compliant. I'm doing scare quotes there for anyone who is only listening, who is highly health literate, but also unquestioning. and whose needs are met by the system as it is currently organized, who can afford things like physiotherapy and massage, who doesn't need a trauma-informed approach to care.
Thanks, Kate. And when it comes to all of those aspects, it comes down to, I think, certain components of accessibility, which is a huge issue in chronic pain in general. But also, I think that a lot of what this institutional ethnography is addressing is, to a certain extent, a critical approach to what has been happening so far. But an interesting thing about taking a critical approach is that established systems sometimes feel as though they're under attack when in reality, the critical approach is often to help things work better. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on just where some of those systems come from that seem to be resisting this growth in just the idea of how to help people manage pain.
Well, that's a really good question and a deep one, Desmond. I think when I'm thinking about critical scholarship, which is almost always subjectivist in its orientation and begins in the lives of the people that it's studying with, not studying on, it's taking place within a research culture, if I will, a research culture that's based on the idea of objectivism and the idea that we study down and people are subjects, not participants in research. And so these are really dominant models and ways of doing research. So when you introduce critical social science research into those domains, it's, I think, seen sometimes in a negative, dismissive, or potentially threatening way, right? Because we are saying things that unsettle, that are disruptive. So those are not always well received.
I think I would also jump in there if it's okay and say, if I was understanding your question the way you intended, Desmond, I think there's also the issue of the kind of institutional power of biomedicine. By that, I mean the kind of power relationship between physicians and patients that has kind of been historically produced and is ongoing, but also the fact that the healthcare system operates in Canada now in a time where other forms of social support are increasingly thin. So you have these healthcare providers who are confronted with really complicated patient situations that they have no training to address. They don't have any capacity to address. And so when you come in there and say taking a critical approach to looking at this health system problem, you have these people who feel that they're very hardworking and very burdened upon, getting really defensive, that they feel that you might be critiquing their work. And that's never what we're trying to do. Never. Fiona said, IE is an approach that looks at what it is to be living within an institution. It's not about hunting down bad doctors. We are not interested particularly in demonizing physicians. It's important to understand their relationship to the system, but people can feel threatened if they feel that they're sort of being examined and judged.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, Kate. This you're mentioning like this hardworking aspect, right? That feels like it's under threat, and it's also making me think about how this is positioned within the patient engagement base, and there has been some hesitancy, as Fiona has mentioned as well, around criticality here, because a lot of the time there's been a lot of time and effort that has gone into patient engagement initiatives. And so people are very protective over that, right? And rightfully so, right? There has been a lot of struggle among people living with pain to be recognized and engaged in research. But I think ultimately confirming again that we're not criticizing the fact that people are being engaged, but rather we're trying to identify and challenge very deeply embedded harmful assumptions and beliefs, and essentially how these assumptions and beliefs evolve and how they're regulated and negotiated over time within the patient engagement space in ways that may inhibit meaningful engagement with specific groups of people who live with chronic pain.
Thanks, Laura. I really think that it's so interesting when we get into these conversations and we talk about the critical eye, that it really always comes from the perspective of wanting to help the people who aren't making things happen in the way that are effective. And to a certain extent, almost based on what you said, Kate, about the idea of trauma-informed care that maybe some doctors don't have or have the framework or understanding for, it also highlights kind of the experience of those people who don't have their needs met either. Their support system is not fully set up so that they can exist as humans as well within being caregivers for other people. And you could say that even if people feel as though this type of work is something that goes against what they're trying to do or what they have established as a system, I feel like they should know that this will help them in the end, as well as people who work with people who are marginalized, because the better we understand it, the better we understand the nuance of these unique aspects of the people that we get to engage with. It also brings together a lot of those through lines and those connections that bring us back to like the human experience of, yeah, just wanting and needing to have our needs met and finding the different ways that we can do that. So thank you all for sharing some of those ideas about that concept, because it really is something that seems abstract, institutional ethnography, but it really is just, it's such a simple idea of truly incorporating human experience into the narrative. And I think that brings up a question that I had for you in how some of this work and some of this research, what we are looking to get out of it is not just numbers, and how there have been times where the story or the identity of a person wasn't valued as much in the narrative of what was being presented for our research. And I'm curious how you think that bringing in the participant, the lived experience voices actually helps to enrich what we bring out as an end product.
You talked about PEPR being hopeful, and I agree. It is aspirational, but I do believe healthcare works largely on this notion of evidence. And what this project is giving us a unique opportunity to do is to gather evidence from different communities and different individuals, people with diverse experiences through multiple different lenses, and bring them all together, which will, I think, be bringing forward really pretty overwhelming evidence in favor of how things might need to change to better accommodate people's experiences within healthcare and within society more broadly.
I think I would also say that with PEPR in particular, we're not just interested in people's experiences as an example, a rich example to make a point. We're also interested in people's experiences to inform our understanding of what we're trying to do, It's not like we interviewed a whole bunch of people and 5 people said this, and so you can see this is what it's like to be a person with marginalization and chronic pain. It's what do these people with marginalization and chronic pain, what do they know about how we should be engaging them that we don't know, so we can find new ways of working.
Yeah, that's such a good point to emphasize, Kate. And what can we learn from them about the system? Because people know what the system is, given their particular view of it from their standpoint. I think all of IE aims to sort of put together this understanding of the social, or they use the term ruling relations that we're living within, right? And sort of through people's standpoint, getting insights about that system that might otherwise be completely invisible.
And also, I think a big part of what the foundation of PEPR is taking that experience not just as a component that leads to evidence, but the experience actually is the evidence in the research.
100%. And I think that's the wonderful name, by the way, of your brilliant podcast, Desmond and Emerald. So I'd actually like to hear from you about that. If you could talk about the title of this podcast, because I think it's beautiful and really reflects what we've just been talking about.
Thanks, Fiona. Emerald, would you like to speak to that first?
I'm thinking about my own experience and how, as I'm wrapping my mind around the concept of IE and how I personally walk through the world and interact in the systems I interact in, and my health journey that has taken me many years of confusion of non-diagnosis and being othered or not believed due to many factors, due to looking young and not believing that anything should be wrong with me because I look young, or not taking any authority because I sound young. And the way that the relationships unfold when I'm trying to build those relationships with health practitioners, and how difficult it is to advocate for myself, regardless of how long I worked in patient advocacy, being a voice for other people and platforming their voices. That's just a little bit there. Yeah, all I can say is exactly what Desmond said, that the experience is the evidence.
Thanks, Emerald. And I think from my perspective, just a couple extra thoughts on that idea and that concept of experience being evidence. I think being able to incorporate that in the idea of research is one of the ways that we approach equity within the research structure, because that is one of the things that we've spoken about, that dynamic of patient and doctor and researcher and people who are being researched, and being able to share your story, share your thoughts, your experience, and have that be taken as something that's actually real, not something that will be translated into a number, translated into something that isn't what it is that you actually said. I think it really gives us an opportunity to not only hear what it is that people are experiencing, but have them feel more confident to share what it is that they're experiencing as well. From what I heard, what you were saying, Emerald, a large part of the issues that you have with self-advocacy is that the direct relations that you have with healthcare practitioners, where there are assumptions about who you are just based on how you look. And those are such obvious things that some people say, oh, there's not as much racism in medical system. People don't have those types of assumptions anymore. It's all based on research and all of this. But it really comes down to the fact that all of us individuals have these unique experiences where it feels as though maybe, oh, is it just in my head that this is what's holding me back from getting better care? But when we look at it in the community level, look at it even as a larger level, just talking about marginalization, I think we really have a chance to highlight that all of this experience, we are being gaslit. And yeah, all of these things really are informing our care, our identities, our intersections, and all of these things. And the more that we're able to highlight, will allow us to find just better and more simple ways that we can care for ourselves and care for others. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking the question, Fiona. And I think that this podcast, just getting started, will be an opportunity for us to really investigate not only the theories that we're going to be working with, but just hearing some of the impact of what it is that we're doing as well, as we continue to try to incorporate the lived experience voices. I have one more question for you all. It is, again, one of these things that we're working with in language. And one of these particular things is, you could say, a newer concept within this newer concept that we're working with in the idea of equity, diversity, inclusion, and Decolonization, otherwise known as EDI-D. And, this is kind of a hot button issue right now. You could say across the continent, there's a lot of political stuff around it. And I think that when we talk about it, it's something that in the end isn't actually that controversial, I don't believe. It's something that it really makes sense in actually including people in everything. Just based on those concepts of EDI that we are currently working with in the zeitgeist, I'm curious why in this project we've decided to add the decolonization aspect to EDID as well.
I think, if I may, again, go first, Desmond, to say that obviously within a Canadian context, as well as others more globally, this idea of decolonization is critical. And just referring back to what I think Laura expressed so eloquently about just from our position in the academy as researchers and academics, we're part of a system that is directly embedded in systems that are oppressive, that have violent histories, that are built on ideas and values and structures that are very colonialist in the ways that we go about getting grants, producing knowledge, all that sort of thing, the way we have to account for what we're doing. So I think decolonization is something that we want to do broadly in society and really want to do within universities as well. I think it's a really important step.
Can I also say, speaking of equity, diversity, and inclusion in general, and decolonization in general, as someone who was trained in the discipline of anthropology, I was really frustrated and disillusioned as I was kind of completing my doctorate that it seemed at that time like you were, expected to confess your race, class, and then it was like, okay, you've done it. You've told us who you are. You've situated yourself in relation to others as though that's all there is to us. And I was talking to a friend recently who, in a similar background to me, she's a white woman who's kind of well educated and grew up with a fair bit of opportunity, who does a huge amount of work with Indigenous communities. And the chief of a First Nation in the Yukon, who she works with very closely, said to her, Jen, what makes you diverse is the way you think. And for me, that is such an aspirational and hopeful way of thinking about diversity because it means it is inclusive without leveling all those ways that we have to continually be thinking about power. So I think that certainly shapes the way that I think about the work that PEPR does, that we're also diverse in our thinking, that we're diverse in the way that we work with one another. And so if that's where we start from, then we have to have a decolonial agenda because I don't think there's another way of doing it that is morally right.
No, and I'm so glad you raised that, Kate. And also, again, I'm so grateful for this SHIRT grant because it's given us enough time that you often don't get in research spaces and enough funds that because we're not here to speak for others, that allows us to sort of give resources to others to do work in different communities, like in Indigenous communities. So I see myself as an ally to people. I don't have to and shouldn't be leading certain projects. We have that opportunity here to do that. Because that's one of the things that can happen in academic research is that people do research with a certain community and then there's this idea that they're giving voice to that community and somehow speaking for them. And that is not what we're doing at all with any of the PEPR projects. We're opening the door.
I think also too, as I'm thinking about, why this inclusion of decolonization, also when I'm thinking about the project focusing on patient engagement among people living with chronic pain and marginalization, understandings of chronic pain are largely grounded within Western medicine. This is how, at least within this particular region, and even Western medicine has come to dominate the globe largely. And so how is it that these specific knowledge systems come to shape how we know and recognize chronic pain in ways that may not provide space or make space for others who are living with various forms of pain that aren't recognized by this dominant system. And so I think when it comes to issues of bringing in this decolonial lens, it is ultimately this process of continually unlearning the hegemonic systems and structures of oppression and domination, right? That have upheld white privilege and, colonial and imperial actions and ideologies. And even speaking of Desmond, you were mentioning earlier, these largely racist understandings of pain and how pain is experienced. And these are also gendered. And there's also, the list can go on. And so I think that adding in this element of decolonization, I think is really important for trying to get a sense of how we can go about engaging meaningfully people living with marginalization and chronic pain, and obviously, and people who are marginalized by this lingering legacy of colonial oppression. So, yeah.
Thanks, Laura and Fiona and Kate. And I really think that just to share a little bit about the structure of PEPR and how this is a project that is incorporating that decolonization in action by having somebody such as myself as a co-director in this project being able to share the lived experience of pain from a leadership point of view as opposed to simply being a person who fills out a survey or checks a box whether I agree with what it is that you guys are saying. And, the reality that I don't come from the institution of research of universities, but you have valued my experience of living with pain for over 30 years and the insights I've been able to draw from that as valuable enough to be a part of this team, not just a part, but a part of the leadership aspect. And from all of you in the process is, you could say that EDID living in action, because oftentimes when it comes to even the grant writing, you mentioned shirk, Fiona, and a limitation in a lot of the research work is the funding for people who are actually participating in the research. And the fact that there was thought in the beginning when you were writing the grants for this and planning that this would be a component where people were paid a living wage, compensated for all of the time and effort that they put in, as opposed to just being a small piece of it, really is something that has set a foundation for us to build something real instead of just talking about building something real. And so I'm really just grateful to be a part of this project. When I was first invited to be a part of the PEPR project in 2022, I didn't really know how I was going to be able to engage in a meaningful way. And so over these last few years, I'm so grateful to have gotten an opportunity to grow and to learn from all of you here, because it really has showed me that there are ways that I can learn how to navigate these systems and institutions. And I feel like I can be an example of what it's like to be empowered, to have your say, and to have the ability to share your thoughts and ideas and have them be held as real and not just abstract concepts. So I thank you all for joining me today on this inaugural episode of Living Proof. And before we finish, I would just like to check in with Emerald and see if you had any last thoughts before we wrapped up.
I was in a place of thinking about how I move through the world as a decolonizing artist and how that is expressed through all the work I do in creating spaces for cultural exchange, which I believe is in connection to healing and chronic pain management, because it's just filling up your cup and being in community. And all of those experiences, along with everything that brought me to have this conversation with you today, just really makes me feel like there was purpose in all of the weird stuff that I was into, because it's so valued in this space, and I can see how it can inform directions, and how it already has when there was a space for us to lift off from. I feel like there's movement and it going this way, and
and we're doing good things with it. And I can't help but feel like I was a part of making that happen a little bit quicker in the last few months. So
Yes,
appreciate
you were.
You were definitely.
it.
And in saying that, I feel reminded of something that you've told me many times, Emerald, that culture saves lives. And I really think that is a part of what we're doing here, and that our work, in the long run, not only has the potential to improve the quality of people's lives who are living with pain, but in the long run could potentially save lives as well, because being neglected and being othered in the medical system and trying to go through it alone is how we lose so many people as well. And being able to find ways that we can incorporate understanding of individuals and where they're coming from and how it's hard for them to engage really can have such a huge impact on the way that we address the medical system across Canada. And so I'm just so grateful for all of the work that everyone is doing here, because it really does feel so important and like it has so much purpose for what is happening in the world right now and how we can better care for each other.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great summation. Yeah. And this wasn't all happening in the world when we started, right? It's become even more sort of urgent, the work we're doing. Yeah.
Everything you said too, I just have to say, culture save life. That comes from downtown East Side community who take care of each other and the programs that are down here. So those are not my words. I'm just naming the teachers of the people on this land, on these stolen, unceded Coast Salish territory, my neighborhood right here. Yeah, culture saves lives. That's why I stay here.
Well, thank you all. It has been an absolute pleasure to work through this conversation, to get to be a part of this. And I'm so proud to be a part of the PEPR Project.
Well, can I just say that I have learned so much from you as well. And I'm grateful for you being on the team and also for the whole team, Kate, Laura, Jacqueline, Emerald, others that I can't name sort of everyone from memory right away. But I think what we've put together here is a pretty incredible team. And I'm very excited for the work that we're doing. And I'm very impressed by this podcast. I'm looking forward to your future episodes.
Thanks, Fiona.
Me
And
too. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yes.
I am grateful to get the opportunity to do this, to explore this particular aspect of the project. I'm glad that we could start this all together too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Desmond and Emerald.